Once upon a time there were two little girls named Deb. One little girl grew up to be a preacher while the other grew up to be a pagan, and they both grew up to be the very best of friends. Join the preacher and the pagan as they take a fresh look at Christianity, from the inside out and the outside in.
Hello, Deb.
Hi, Deb.
Hi, welcome to The Preacher and the Pagan. So, Deb, we have an interesting topic that I don't think gets talked about a lot, and that is Joseph
Well,
and Mary.
I think the part that gets over talked about, and not with a whole lot of knowledge is probably Mary herself and how old she was, or wasn't in some
Mhm.
cases, and the conversation of consent. But no, outside of that, you're right. There's not much conversation, particularly about Joseph. But
Right.
yeah, Mary is as the person is not talked about at all.
Well, I grew up Catholic, so Mary is really, really intrinsic in that faith. And as a pagan, Mary is actually considered by many pagans as, if not a goddess, goddess adjacent, maybe. She
Hmm.
shows up in a lot of the goddess card packs that I see.
Hmm.
Um, so Mary, I think, has a lot more public support, perhaps, or at least public awareness than Joseph does. Joseph is just the guy who, said, okay, I'll grab the burro and we'll head out to Bethlehem and I'll keep the shepherds at bay, man. Let's do this.
Right? And
I don't know if he even showed up at a Lamaze class.
every nativity play I have ever staged, the person who plays Joseph said, "Yeah, I'm just going to stand here." That's that's what they think. So let's dive in and talk about who these people were historically, because I think they're actually quite interesting. I mean, these are the people who raised Jesus. And
Hmm.
we spend so much time talking about the spirituality and was Jesus God, wasn't God. But we kind of forget the humanity there, that Jesus was fully human. And these were the people who raised that and made that possible. And that's,
Oh,
I think, a lot of who they are actually comes out in Jesus' own ministry. Just like all
yeah.
of our kids are a representation of who we are.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus hits 27, 28, and gets started in, or 30, and hits his ministry, and he's been raised by a bunch of, jerks who are all about money and all of this. We might have had a very different Bible, you
Oh,
know?
very much. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I just some of the assumptions about Mary and Joseph also, that she was like 12, which is a really wrong reading of um, culture 2,000 years ago, marriage 2,000 years ago, and essentially puberty 2,000 years ago. Because I've watched as I've aged that the assumption of Mary has gone from 14 to 13 to 12 to 11, depending on when modern girls start their period. So there's no
Right.
kind of
And
awareness that 2,000 years ago, they didn't have the nutrition and health care that we have. They didn't
the,
hit um, pregnancy age until 14, 15, 16. So
and they
Mary was
didn't eat all
actually
the meat
maybe a
that was
teenager.
treated with
No,
hormones and everything
no, not at all.
that forces earlier puberty.
Precisely. So there's that kind of, if Mary's going to be talked about in popular culture, I find that is what people talk about without any sense of historic
Mhm.
contextualizing. Mary, as we know her, came from a relatively um, they didn't have middle class like we understand middle class, but she wasn't a poor child. And that's something else that a lot of Christian groups actually give into, this whole business about Jesus being dirt poor. There's no evidence of that. In fact, Mary herself, in the Feast of Cana, in the second chapter of the book of John, she is a guest herself. Jesus is just the accompanying person. She is the guest at a 3-day wedding of a very rich family in Cana. So she has those political and maybe
Mhm.
familial or relationship connections to people of standing and wealth. Like, she was a full-fledged invitee into a big social engagement. So she's not dirt poor. And the other thing I find really fascinating about Mary, we talked about this in our podcast on Mary Magdalene last year, and picked it up a little bit when we talked about the tradition of Christmas. But the name Mary has was very political in that day, because it was a reaction to Herod the Great, I believe it was, killing his wife Mariamos. So that whole generation of girls was given the name Mary as a form of social protest. And I think that tells us something about Jesus' grandparents. We don't even think of grandparents for him, but
Wasn't her mother named Anne?
Well, that's the tradition holds. We have no real. There's nothing that
well,
supports
every
that.
Catholic girl's middle name is either Anne or Mary, you know.
Right. And it's a lovely tradition, but there's no historic way to know the answer to that one way or the other.
Well, I think, just as an outsider looking in, you get the traditional nativity tale. You see Mary and Joseph hightailing it on a donkey, the popular thing, and they're sleeping in a barn. It's gonna make you look like, well, you couldn't afford the Four Seasons.
Precisely.
But what they kind of forget is, whether they were rich or not, they were refugees, and they also were in a place that did not have accommodations. They tried to get accommodations.
Well,
and
according to the story,
interesting
culture of the day, probably Joseph's people would have found accommodations for them. She would have been around women midwives. We have to separate kind of the historical stuff from the narrative stuff. And the narrative stuff is what we talk about. The historic stuff, it doesn't really mesh up. A lot of people don't want to get their head around the fact that a lot of the nativity story as we know it is actually narrative and metaphor.
Where does that come from?
Well, you have to remember, back at that time, traditions borrowed from each other. That's kind of one of the reasons why this whole Christianity stole fill in the blank kind of drives me insane, because it doesn't recognize that the Babylonians borrowed from the Assyrians, and the Romans borrowed from the Greeks, and the Hebrews borrowed from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians borrowed from the Mesopotamians, and like everybody shared things. And myths of origin of great people was a very, very common thing. You see it in Greek mythology. You see it in Babylonian mythology. Precisely.
Anywhere in the world, from South America to Norway, you're going to see origin stories.
Absolutely. And it's our need for great people to be born of greatness. Because that sets them apart. That's why we don't necessarily accomplish anything, because we were not born great. It's a very short-sighted interpretation, but I think it's a universal feeling. And the thing is, Jesus and Mary and Joseph were nobodies until after the resurrection. And that's like 33 years on. Up until that point in time, they could just fade into the woodwork with everybody else. It's not until the story of Easter morning then we read back into everything that Jesus and Mary and Joseph were part of. But until that point in time, they're just like everybody else in the Middle East in the Hebrew time
Mary
period.
was just a woman with a 30-year-old hippie son who got in trouble with the law.
Yes.
Oy, poor Mary.
And Jesus
he seemed like such a nice guy.
Right. Well, she believed in him to the best. I mean, she was at the foot of the cross, and she did participate in his ministry. So she really did believe in him. So we have to kind of separate the story, and I do not want to call it mythology, because there's truth in it as well. And it'll set off too many reactions completely. But I think we have to walk very gently with historic boots through the nativity story. I think it is a much more profound metaphorical story that we can take the message that everything that was expected was turned on its head with the arrival of Jesus, which I think is a completely legitimate interpretation of all of it, regardless of where we get caught up in the details.
Well, after 2000 years, myth and history are extremely hard to extricate from each other.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so
And
and
I think they
especially
feed
when you
into
don't
each other.
have, yeah, they feed into each other, but you also don't have a whole hell of a lot of written or concrete documentation that
Yeah.
is going to say, oh, no, 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 this is what
No.
happened. But this is what happens with anyone who is trying to plumb the depths of history. You have to separate myth from
Yes.
experience and understand that myth sometimes informs what actually
Right.
happened.
Yes. And it's best guess practice when it comes to where we look for the historicity. And one of the ways we can do that is kind of to look at not directly at the story, but kind of
But the
almost from the
culture,
side. The what I do when I talk about contextual and setting and whatever, it's kind of looking at the background of things. And I think that's where we actually learn about Joseph, not head on. We can be a little more head on with Mary, and we can be fairly head on with Jesus, but with Joseph, the only parts of scripture that talk about Joseph is the beginning of Matthew, where
mhm,
it mentions the angel coming to Joseph and telling him it's all cool with Mary, don't leave her and make her vulnerable. And the other part is in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is 13, and he's right at that cusp where he's about to become a man, which meant that he could travel that Passover with either his mother as a child or his father as an adult, because the men and women traveled in separate groups and
right.
didn't come together until evening. So it's understandable that that trip, each parent thought Jesus was with the other. And when they realized that evening they didn't have him, then they rushed back. So those are the
Yeah.
only two places that Joseph is mentioned. And the only other place where it's mentioned about Joseph's family is that in Mark, we hear of 4 sons and several daughters. Now, the sons have names, the daughters don't, but that's pretty typical
That's,
of a whole lot of
yeah,
patriarchy. Um,
yeah.
but it's interesting.
Now,
The church has taken that
these sons
passage,
are Joseph's brothers or Jesus's brothers?
Jesus' brothers. Now, this is where the church has done
Really?
some interesting dances over the years because of the myth of perpetual virginity for
Virginity.
Mary. Yeah, she's caught in this kind of vortex of perpetual virginity. So, what do we do with these children who are Joseph's? So the church has come up with a couple of different solutions, and depending on where you land, you're going to pick up on them. One is that Joseph was a really old man, that Mary was his second wife, and that the children were actually Joseph's from his first marriage. So they weren't technically brothers of Jesus anyway. They just kind of grew up together.
Half
That's
brothers. I mean,
that's
yeah.
no, not even, because Joseph isn't recognized as the birth father
Oh,
of
that's
Jesus.
right.
So
That's
they wouldn't have any
right.
biological connection at all. They just kind of grew up as pseudo siblings. Um,
Stepbrothers.
that's one myth, precisely. Another line of thought is that they're not really brothers; they're actually cousins, but they all grew up in a huge extended family and they acted like siblings. So that's where that comes from. That has even less to support it than the whole concept of the second family. But the church was so wedded to the virginity, perpetual virginity of Mary, that they created. There was, well, I mean, Mariology is there's an actual book called Mariology
Oh,
that came
yeah.
out in the Middle Ages that has Anne, and has even Anne as a virgin, and Mary's birth was miraculous as well. It's a fantastic story, but it's not theological, and Protestants don't recognize it, of course. But another story that came out was that, much like Hannah dedicated Samuel to the temple as a small child, that Anne dedicated Mary to the temple, which we have no history, to my knowledge, of girls being dedicated like that. But that Mary
Yeah.
dedicated, it was
Maybe
dedicated to
that
the
came from the
temple.
Greek influence.
Well, that's just it. This sounds very Vestal Virgin, actually,
Yeah,
Roman.
it does. Roman
Um,
and
Precisely. And the Romans got their fingers in on these stories too, relatively early on. So the story goes that Mary was dedicated in the temple, and that when she was about 9, she had to go live with a godly person. She couldn't go back to her parents for some reason. And so the members of the temple picked Joseph because he was older and he would not do anything improper with her in his care. And so that's how she developed the relationship she eventually had with Joseph. So that's
Well,
3
they will
very
go through
different stories.
they will go through hoops of fire to keep women from having sexuality, won't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, they're not the only ones. I mean, Athena, one of the greatest goddesses in Greek culture, did
Yep.
not have a natural birth. She had to come from a man, but she couldn't come from a
Oh,
woman.
God forbid.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is not unnatural for that time in history. And we have to remember that these are ancient stories that people were not the least bit concerned with for accuracy or scientific validity or historicity. These were stories that convinced people of the miraculousness of these small group of people who walked on earth but weren't really of the earth.
So that
So
makes it really, really challenging in modern times because we are extremely addicted to proof.
yes,
We are
yes,
addicted. We tend to discount anything that we can't find concrete evidence for. And with
yeah,
good reason. You do want concrete evidence for things, but when you get into the realm of faith,
yeah.
um, it makes it a lot more problematic.
It
So
does. And even ancient history, a lot of the resources were written on
yes,
papyrus if they were written at all. And these have
yes.
all literally disappeared into the
Well,
sand or the water.
fragments, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, if we have any hint of them at all. Yeah. I
Right.
think one of the ways we can see people, like, I think this is where we learn about Joseph, I think most accurately, is how um Jesus deals with a relationship with older men. And one of the things that comes up again and again in the Christian scriptures is Jesus comparing our relationship with God with the relationship between a child and a father.
Got
And
it. That
Joseph
means
is
he
the
had a
only
good dad.
example. He had a good dad. And I think that tells us everything we need to know about Joseph. This is a man who stepped up, who took care of a child, whether there was sex before marriage or not, I really think is an academic discussion. I don't really care a whole lot as a Protestant, and that people shoot me on that one. But the fact of the matter is, for all intents and purposes, he assumed the parental responsibility for a child. He was not part of the creation process that was made, that had him made. But he stood up and he raised him and taught him
Mhm.
his trade. So Jesus spends his early life as someone working in the business that Joseph was working in. So
So,
there's a really close connection there.
so let me ask you something.
Hmm.
From a historical context, let's take a look at maybe 6 or 7 year old Jesus. All right.
Mhm.
What would his life look like? What would Joseph and Mary look like? I mean, how would that happen? I mean, would Mary stay home and cook and clean for Joseph? Would for Jesus and Joseph go out and do his work and come home like typical 9 to 5 type thing? Or what would that look like in that time frame as compared to modern day?
Well, they're actually it looks a lot like that. Now Joseph, we talk about him being a carpenter. The Bible talks about him, a word that has been translated carpenter. It actually means not carpenter specifically, but master craftsman.
Mhm.
So the functioning theory is Nazareth was a small community of maybe a couple of hundred people, very close to a Greek city, which name escapes me at the moment, that was being rebuilt. So Joseph was probably going into town every day to work on the rebuilding that was going on in that area. So as a master craftsperson, he would have been paid fairly well. So they were able to live in relative comfort of the day. There was very rich Hebrews, more very poor Hebrews, They were kind of in the middle somewhere, although not what we would fully understand as middle class, but they were comfortable. As far as Mary, yeah, she'd be taking care of the food and the children and whatever else. She may or may not have had help. It would have been part of an extended family, although the wife usually moves to the husband's household. And we have it that they lived in Nazareth away from his people in Bethlehem. So we don't know quite how that would have looked. But she would have been Jesus' educator. She would have been the one to teach him how to read, how to do basic math, because women are responsible for the household economy. This is a traditional dividing line in Hebrew culture, has the economy of the house not as a man's duty but as a woman's duty. So she would have taught him if there was anything that she produced, foodstuffs, clothing, whatever that she produced, he would have been part of that experience. She would have been his primary instructor in the faith. Joseph would have been part of that when he was there, but Mary would have been telling Jesus stories of their faith history, helping him read scripture. She might have had writing skills. Some Greek women and Roman women of the time did. And one of the ways you can see that is if you look at any of the pictures of Pompeii, there are women with books and stylus. There was a wax type of thing that they were able to write in. They could erase and they could rewrite and they could write letters back and forth. So we have contemporaneous examples of women's writing at that time. So she could very well have taught Jesus how to write as well as she knew. But all of his education would have been done at home by his mom. All of his knowledge of the Hebrew tradition, all of his knowledge of ritual. Joseph would have contributed, but he wouldn't have been the primary on that one.
It's fascinating.
Yep.
It's funny because that is something that you don't hear. You hear, oh, she gave birth to him, plopped out, and then miraculously they went to they went to the temple 13 years later, then boom, there was a wedding, then damn, he's dead. I mean, that's pretty much his whole life, as far as with his family. But you got to remember, this guy lived with these people for a long time, and that was his daily life before he started his ministry.
And we knew Joseph was still alive by the time Jesus was 13. And in that culture, they didn't celebrate birthdays. That's why when we talk about Christmas celebrations, that was actually a Roman invention. We talked about this a bit last year when we talked about Christmas history. So 13 was the special age. Now, who was counting and how that worked out, I don't know that anybody has that part figured out yet. But Joseph, according to the Gospel of Luke, was still around and healthy enough that he was going on pilgrimage. So Jesus had his father up till technically he was considered a man. So that is a lot of years of influence of someone who was incredibly skilled, incredibly dedicated to his family, incredibly focused on making sure his children had what they needed.
Why do we feel like this story has to be, I don't know, I'm not going anywhere with this. So I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna intuitively pick up on your question. There's two ways I can see it going. Why do we continuously teach the nativity scene as the only history, and why do we not spend time looking at Jesus as a human being?
Thank you. You read my mind. That's exactly where I was going with that. Right. Why focus on the myth and not the history?
I think, first of all, because the myth is easy. It's accessible. It's repeated. Every person, my experience has been you go to a nativity play and it is a fantastic play. And even though it's the same lines, the same costumes, sometimes even the same children year after year after year, there's a newness and a richness of that because the entire understanding of God born in human form is just so absolutely miraculous that we want to stay in that. It's fun to parse the details. Like I'll every year I'll see someone saying, well, it should have been the wise women that showed up, and they would have shown up with casseroles and diapers, not incense, myrrh and frankincense.
What the hell am I going to do with myrrh?
Right? Yeah. And and that it would have been women there with Jesus, with Mary being born. It wouldn't have been a carpenter who didn't know
What
right
he
from
was
wrong at
doing.
that end of a woman's body. But there's no, it's one of the things you do in history. The history kind of takes away the mystique. And I think we like the mystique. We like going to services in the evening and light candles and to tell the old traditional story over and over and over again. There's comfort in there and there's gentleness in there. And I
And
think that's one of the reasons we look at the myth. When it comes to the history and who these people were, quite honestly, I don't think too many people have just done the work. They haven't asked the questions. They've been quite content with simple answers because the focus has always been on Christ the King, Christ God incarnate. And this is the earliest arguments in Christian history are those on Christology. What do we do with this fully human person who is supposed to be the Messiah, who's supposed to be God incarnate? How do we mesh that together? We can thank the Greeks for this kind of intellectual
nightmare.
smorgasbord
Yeah.
because they wanted to have answers. The Hebrews were much comfortable with ambiguity, but the Greeks wanted to have answers, and they worked really for centuries. I mean, there was fighting, there was fisticuffs, there was murder trying to figure out Christology, and
Mm.
we spent so much time trying to figure out the God part that we lost focus on the human part. And I think that is one of the sins that has continued in the church for 2000 years is our struggle to get back in touch with the humanity of Jesus as opposed to worshiping the Christ.
Well, and the
So
other
that
part is when you are looking at the myth and you decide that the myth is fact, and you start basing your theology, and not only your theology but your the way you function in society on that, and you try to start by focusing only on the myth, you are basically creating a situation that is almost impossible for your followers,
mhm,
and then basically what you've done is you set an incredible and impossible standard by denying Christ's humanity,
yeah,
and basically implying that, well, you can't possibly live up to this mythological standard that we have, so you must be lesser than,
mhm,
you are basically sinful, you can't achieve this without our help.
right, yeah,
you
no, I think
know
you're absolutely correct that way. It's a great way to control what's going on, but we also have to appreciate that there are those who were intellectually trained in the church and those who were not. And those
Mhm.
who were not were primarily the priests in the communities. So the intelligentsia would have continued some of these conversations at a level far removed from the average person, while the priests and ministers were interpreting things their way for the people. So even if these questions were asked, they wouldn't necessarily have filtered to the people who were finding answers, and those answers wouldn't necessarily have filtered to the people who were asking questions. So the
and
simplicity of the narrative has a through line because it doesn't really challenge.
Right. And unfortunately, what happened also was at the bottom level, if you were just a regular parishioner or churchgoer, and you did have these questions, and you were obnoxious enough to ask these questions to a priest or a preacher who did not have the answers and had that personality, then the results were not happy. And
No,
so it almost set itself up so that people were designed not to ask difficult questions. You know what I mean?
absolutely. And so they lose a lot of the, in my opinion, the real wonder about this. I mean, when I look at the story of the Nativity, I mean, I tell it every year. I've got dolls that I acted out with.
I
I've
love
run
your
nativity
dolls.
plays. Thank you. I
Your
do this
little
every
shepherds make
year.
me happy. with their
But
little beards.
I tell the story. I watch the cartoons. I do. I'm part of perpetuating that particular story. Now, in my sermons, I unpack it as much as I possibly can. But also, you're riding that wave between people's comfort and where they want to grow and explore.
Right.
And when it
Yes.
comes to Christmas, there's a lot of emotion around that area.
Oh gosh,
But
yes.
there's just a lot of well, I mean, first of all, exhaustion. By the time you get to Christmas Eve service, most of us are so done. We don't necessarily bring our best to the pulpit. But the thing is that these are not these are not the questions most people ask when they're wanting to struggle um, with theology and the Bible and whatever else, because this is your comfort place. It's kind of like the 23rd Psalm. Everybody goes back and relaxes into it because it has so much poetic meaning that no one really wants to pick it apart too much. The story
Right.
of Luke particularly is one of these stories. We want to settle into the Magnificat, and we want to settle into Mary holding her baby and the angels announcing and the shepherds on the hill coming and the
And
star
there's
leading the
nothing
wise
wrong with
ones.
that.
Not at all.
But you
And
have to
so,
also remember that this is something that this is a comfort zone, and
yeah,
that this is not God. God came down from the to the mountains and wrote it in a stone tablet. Fact.
no, no,
And
but
that's the problem, is when we lose that distinction.
absolutely. But I can tell you from my side of the pulpit, you don't get the time to unpack Easter and unpack Christmas like you'd like to, because the
Okay.
church year keeps moving on. So I have much more time to unpack a parable than I have to unpack why there's 4 different versions of Jesus' resurrection.
Or
People are
Jesus's
not
birth,
there
for
for
that
that.
matter.
Oh yeah, there's 2 different versions. I mean, really, really early on, the church harmonized Matthew's and Luke's version, and suddenly we have the wise men and the shepherds showing up at the same time on the same night. They're not even in the same
But no.
gospels, but
Yeah.
we are so used to that as the story that even people outside of the church who want to take a few moments to be, we call them C&E Christians, so Christmas and Easter Christians, that's the only story they recognize, is everything happening that one night. And there's just not the time to stop and unpack it. So sometimes it's just easier to go with the seasonal flow, and you never have an opportunity to really spend time to unpack. And after several generations, no one really picks up on the fact that there are things to unpack here, and that we come up with silly memes that we can chuckle about, but they do not help us get at some of the deeper questions and meanings behind it. Like, who were these people? What did they do in the education of their son? How did they raise a being that the world can recognize as the Messiah? What did they teach him politically about justice? That's the other thing. These people were obviously very tied in to the socioeconomic happenings of their time period. Jesus was very well versed, not only in scripture, but also in politics. So to take a step back to look at his parents, I mean, it's a wonderful series of conversations, but no one really is talking about it, even in academic circles. So that information doesn't filter through. And
thank goodness for 2 nerds named Deb who have a podcast. We're
absolutely,
going there, B.
absolutely, yeah. I think there's incredible people. Most of the people that we encounter in the Christian scriptures, well, the Hebrew scriptures as well, but the Christian scriptures are closer to our time period. They were very politically, socially active justice seekers.
Well,
And Jesus was the
you don't
ultimate
get
one.
you don't get publicly executed by the Romans if you're not political. I'm sorry.
No,
It's
you
just
don't.
no.
You don't. And I think that's where the church, as I said,
Yeah.
that's where the church has failed to focus on who Jesus was as the politically active human being.
Well, if
And
you
and
focus
that
on
I
who
think
Jesus
is
was politically, then you've also got to focus on his social justice message. And then you've got to focus on the
Yep.
fact that you need to be
We're not
doing
doing it.
good deeds and they're not. Yeah, it all
Yeah,
comes down to the
yeah,
same thing. You're,
absolutely. Keeping it spiritual, keeping it mythical, keeping it God above the clouds is a lot easier and requires less action on behalf of church people. But I
yeah,
think in my ministry, in my preaching, in my teaching, um, the Christ is good, but people are hungry for the Jesus. They want to know
yeah,
about Jesus, who he was, who he could have been, where he came from, what he taught, why he picked these fights,
mhm,
why things happen. And it doesn't have to divorce the incarnation at all, but it's kind of shifting the focus a little bit to be more
yeah.
about the person who we can emulate as opposed to the God incarnate who we have no
Yeah.
possible way of emulating.
Well, and I think that kind of me for me as a pagan, it makes it a lot easier for me. I know that my gods are metaphor. I know they're myth. I am aware of that. And you know what? It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the lessons I'm being taught. It doesn't change the example that's being set. It doesn't change the challenges that I'm facing. Whereas when you're in a situation where you have to figure out what was the historical human, what was the myth, what was the metaphor, it does ask a lot more of you. I think my faith in some ways is a little bit easier because I don't have to worry about that. I know in my heart that these are stories that were told. I know that these were mythoses that were created to understand the world, and I can still have my full faith with that knowledge. Whereas I think Christians struggle a little bit more to recognize the fact that they can have their faith, they can understand the mythology of it, they can understand that a lot of it is metaphor, and still be legitimate in that faith. You don't have to have a it wouldn't be faith if everything was provable.
Well, yeah, and you'll see a lot more of theologians that are encouraging people to be doubting in their faith. That's the whole point, is you have
Mhm.
faith with doubting. The two have to go together. I think you're right. I think Christians have been told for so many generations that if even if you don't understand it, you have to accept it. That the concept of challenging or asking questions often means if I have these doubts, I have to leave because I can't be part of the faith anymore. And
Exactly.
that's really sad to see. And I think our next we're in that 500-year changeover in Christianity. Every 500 years, there's been a big, massive change, and I think
Mhm.
I'm hoping that's where we're going to end up once we get over our kind of Oedipus complex and a lot of stuff that has been
Yeah.
in the way gets out of the way. That we go back to um, being okay with questions and being okay with
Yeah.
doubts and being okay with looking at a couple of people from Nazareth who were put on the spot with no actual training or background that we know of, who managed to raise the person who changed the world
Yep. And I
and
love
get
that.
to know them.
I think in the new year I want to look in a lot more about the real people and the socioeconomics about this, because I think that's a really fascinating trend. But we are coming close to the end, my
We
friend.
are dear. Yep.
I'm ready for
So we
Christmas. You
should let this
ready?
go. Oh, heavens, no. I've got way too many children and way too many things that I'm still making for Christmas. But come what may, Christmas Eve, I will be sitting here with my brood around me, celebrating over more than a few glasses of wine and some hot artichoke dip.
Well, Merry Christmas to you, my friend, and Merry Christmas to our listeners. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you. And happy holidays, happy Yule, happy everything else to
Okay.
all folks, including happy Christmas. You take
All
care,
right.
Deb.
You too, sweetie. All right.
Okay.
I'll talk to you later. Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Preacher and the Pagan with Deborah Suttard and Deborah Bodwin. This podcast is a two-lady podcast production in conjunction with The Barefoot Evangelist. Our producer and sound editor is Catherine Gordon. Our theme music was composed by Deborah Bodwin. You can reach us at thepreacherandthepagan@gmail.com or by visiting our website at barefootevangelist.ca/podcast.